This happened maybe 8 or 9 months after I moved into my very first house. I was 24 years old at the time, fresh out of college, and lucky enough to have landed a decent job that paid the bills. All you really need to know about this house is that it had an incredibly spacious basement. Since I had just moved in, I mostly used the space for storage, keeping old moving boxes and random gear down there. The previous owners of the house had done some DIY work. They had partitioned the basement into several separate rooms using cheap sheets of plywood and exposed wooden framing. This gave the entire basement a very strange maze-like quality. When you walked down, there was a main open area at the bottom of the stairs, then a laundry section off to the side, then what I assumed was supposed to be a workshop, and finally, this weird back room that was mostly just a dark void used for storage. Because of those plywood walls, you couldn't actually see the entire basement from any single vantage point. I remember thinking this was kind of cool when I first toured the place with my real estate agent. It felt unique, almost like a secret hideout, but that feeling of novelty would not last. It was a typical weekday night. I had worked a long shift, and I needed to go downstairs to do my laundry. Doing laundry was really the only time I ever went down into the basement because the space was drafty, cold, and not particularly inviting. As I approached the basement door, I noticed that the lights down there were already turned on. I paused for a moment. I thought that was a bit weird, but I didn't dwell on it for very long. I had been down there a few days earlier to drop off some boxes, so I figured I had simply forgotten to turn them off when I came back upstairs. It seemed like a perfectly logical explanation, so I opened the door and started walking down the wooden stairs. The basement was quite dim, even with the lights turned on. I had not bothered to change the old yellow incandescent bulbs that had been there when I first moved in. They cast a warm, sickly yellow glow over the plywood partitions, creating long, heavy shadows that stretched across the concrete floor. I made it to the bottom of the stairs, carrying my plastic laundry basket, and started walking toward the laundry area. And then, without any warning, things escalated so abruptly that my brain couldn't keep up. As I took a step forward, I saw a flash of movement in my peripheral vision. It was over near the far corner of the basement, behind one of the folding plastic tables I had set up for sorting my clothes. Instinctively, I turned my head to look, and that is when I locked eyes with a man. He was a stranger, and he was crouching behind the folding table, trying to hide. The sight was so incredibly unsettling that my hands shook, and I almost dropped my laundry basket. My brain simply refused to register what my eyes were seeing. There was literally a stranger hiding in my basement, in my own home. I stood there, completely frozen in fear, unable to move a single muscle. All I could do was stare at this intruder, who was now staring directly back at me, and it was not a pleasant stare. He looked absolutely disheveled, as if he had just crawled out of a sewer or had been living in the wild. His clothes were filthy, his hair was matted, and his eyes had a desperate, manic look to them. And then, suddenly he stood up. But instead of running toward me, he bolted in the opposite direction, running further into the basement, disappearing behind the plywood partitions toward the dark rooms in the very back. That sudden, explosive movement snapped me out of my frozen, fear-induced haze. My survival instincts kicked in, and I began moving backward, desperately trying to reach the basement stairs so I could get back up to the safety of my kitchen. But I must have wasted too much time standing there in shock. Before I could even take a step up the wooden stairs, all of the lights in the basement suddenly went out. Until that exact moment, I had never been down in that basement with the lights off. I had never anticipated just how dark it would be. It was fully, completely pitch black down there. It was a suffocating, absolute darkness where you couldn't even see your own hand in front of your face. But I mistakenly assumed that I knew the layout of my own house well enough to navigate it. I kept trying to move toward the stairs in the dark, but in my panic I misjudged my steps. My foot caught on an old box and I tripped, crashing hard onto the cold concrete floor. By the time I scrambled back to my feet, I was completely and utterly disoriented. The sheer chaos and overwhelming fear of the situation were completely short-circuiting my brain. I couldn't think straight. To make matters worse, my phone was sitting upstairs on the kitchen counter, so I couldn't just reach into my pocket and turn on a flashlight. I was trapped in the dark with a stranger, and I was entirely blind. In a desperate bid to protect myself, I started screaming at the top of my lungs. I was trying to sound like an absolute lunatic. I thought that if I sounded crazy and dangerous enough, it might scare off whoever had broken into my house, but it turns out that strategy must have energized them instead. Because suddenly, I started hearing screaming coming from the other side of the basement. It was terrifying. I was screaming into the darkness to make myself seem dangerous, and someone on the other side of the room was doing the exact same thing back to me. But his screaming was much, much more intimidating than mine. He didn't sound like a scared homeowner. He legitimately sounded like a raving psychopath. He sounded like a murderer. The sheer terror of his voice shut me up immediately. I stopped screaming, and the moment I went quiet, he followed suit. The basement plunged back into a heavy, suffocating silence. With no other choice, I started trying to navigate my way around the basement purely by touch. I reached my hands out, feeling the cold plywood walls, trying to find my way back to the stairs. But then, I started hearing movement. It was the sound of soft, shuffling footsteps. He was doing the exact same thing. He was navigating the dark, and the sounds were getting closer and closer to me. Amidst the sheer horror of everything, I couldn't help but get the chilling sense that this man knew my own basement far better than I did. He was moving through the obstacles with a terrifying ease, while I was stumbling and fumbling in the dark. I knew I was getting closer to the stairs, but the basement was massive, and every second felt like an eternity. Then, I started hearing heavy breathing coming from somewhere directly behind me. He was right there. I genuinely believed, with every fiber of my being, that he was about to catch me and kill me in the dark. I made one final, desperate reach forward, and my hand finally connected with the cold, wooden base of the staircase. I grabbed the railing and started running up the stairs, but before I could even hit the second step, something cold and strong grabbed my ankle. I lost my grip on the railing. My head struck the hard wood as I fell backward, tumbling all the way back down to the concrete basement floor. The pain was sharp, but the adrenaline was pumping too hard for me to stop. I still couldn't see the guy, but I could feel his hands on me. He was dragging me away from the stairs, deeper into the darkness, and he possessed what genuinely felt like inhuman strength. I knew that if he dragged me into the back rooms, I would never come out alive. I began kicking and thrashing my legs with all my might, desperately trying to break his grip. Miraculously, one of my kicks connected solidly with something hard, likely his face or chest. The strike was just strong enough for him to lose his grip. I twisted and turned on the floor, wriggling out of his grasp, and scrambled back to my feet. I started running back toward the stairs in the pitch black. Behind me, the man started screaming again, a loud, angry roar. But I found the wooden steps before he could catch me. I scrambled up the stairs in the dark, burst through the basement door into my kitchen, and slammed it shut behind me. But the nightmare was far from over. The problem was, that basement door didn't have a lock on it. I had no way to secure it. I had no choice but to throw my entire body weight against the wood, and pray that I was strong enough to keep him from pushing it open. Just as I suspected, I heard the heavy sound of footsteps pounding up the wooden stairs mere seconds later. Then, there was a massive crash against the door. The force of the impact was so strong that the door actually swung open for a terrifying second, exposing the dark stairwell. It took everything in my power, every ounce of strength I had, to push it closed again. The first impact must have emboldened him, because he immediately began repeatedly slamming his body against the door. The wood groaned, and the hinges rattled. I realized my bare feet were slipping on the kitchen tile, so I quickly yanked off my socks to get better traction, digging my heels into the floor and pushing against the wood. I knew my life depended on it. I have no idea how he didn't make it through, but after several violent slams, he eventually gave up. I heard his heavy footsteps crashing back down the basement stairs. I immediately seized the opportunity. I ran over to the kitchen counter, grabbed my phone, and ran right back to the basement door, pressing my back against it to keep it shut. With my hands shaking violently, I called the police. When the police finally arrived and searched the house, the guy was gone. I kind of had a feeling he would be. The officers searched the basement and found that one of the small windows had been forced open from the outside. It didn't take a genius to figure out what had happened, but there was nothing missing from the basement. No tools, no boxes, nothing was stolen. Because of this, one of the officers suggested a theory that was somehow worse than a simple robbery. He suggested that the intruder had probably been using my basement as a place to live or hide, potentially for weeks. The other reason the police arrived at this theory was that the intruder knew exactly where the basement light switch was. It wasn't in an obvious place at all. It was tucked away behind a partition. The only way he could have known how to turn the lights off so quickly was if he had been living down there and studying the layout while I was away. It made perfect sense, and it was a horrifying thought. I had been sleeping, eating, and living my life, completely unaware that a desperate, dangerous stranger was living right beneath my feet. I ended up moving out of that house about 4 months after the incident. I just couldn't bear to be in that space anymore. Thinking about it now, years later, only confirms what I felt that night. That guy was fully prepared to kill me, and if things had played out just a little bit differently, he probably would have. And so, that brings us to our second story, which is just as unsettling. This one happened to a different person when they were only 14 years old. Today, they are in their 30s, meaning this took place nearly 20 years ago, but the memory of that night remains as vivid as if it happened yesterday. It all started on a weekend when the teenager's parents had to drive out of state to attend a wedding. Normally, a 14-year-old is old enough to be left home alone for a couple of days, but the parents were overprotective. They didn't want to leave them completely unsupervised. So, the original plan was for their older sister to come over and stay for the weekend. The sister was already in college, but her campus was only about an hour away, so it seemed like an easy arrangement. But the problem was, as soon as the parents drove out of the driveway, the older sister sent a text message. She said she had a huge college party to go to and wasn't going to make it. She told them to just keep it a secret. The 14-year-old didn't really care. In fact, they were kind of excited to have the whole place to themselves. They didn't bother telling their parents about the sister canceling, partly because they didn't want to stress them out during the wedding, and partly because they didn't want their parents calling some local neighbor to come watch them. They wanted their freedom, besides. The house was located in a very safe, quiet suburban neighborhood. It was a classic 2-story home surrounded by nice families, so there was absolutely no reason to worry. The afternoon and evening went by completely without incident. The teenager spent about 6 hours straight playing Halo on the TV, eating junk food, and enjoying the quiet house. It was the kind of lazy, uninterrupted gaming session that any kid would dream of. But fast forward to just after midnight, and things began to get incredibly weird. The teenager was still lounging on the couch, the living room dimly lit only by the glow of the television screen. Suddenly, they heard a very faint, rhythmic tapping sound. It seemed to be coming from somewhere in the backyard, right against the side of the house. At first, they didn't think much of it. It sounded exactly like a loose tree branch or some wind-blown debris lightly hitting the siding. It was a common house noise, so they remained calm and kept playing their game. But a few minutes later, the sound happened again. It was the exact same tapping, nearly identical to the first. The teenager tried to tell themselves it was just the wind, but then the tapping began to migrate. It wasn't staying in one spot. It was slowly moving along the side of the house, as if whatever was making the noise was walking along the exterior wall. At this point, a cold wave of unease washed over them. The movement was far too deliberate, far too intentional to be caused by a random gust of wind or a tree. It felt like something sentient was out there, testing the walls. The teenager grabbed the remote and muted the television. They froze in place, sitting completely still on the couch, barely daring to breathe. They listened intently, straining their ears in the sudden silence of the house. But now, there was nothing, just quiet. After about a minute of dead silence, they began to rationalize. They convinced themselves that it must have just been a raccoon or a stray cat scuttling along the foundation. They took a deep breath, turned the volume back up, and tried to focus on their game. But 20 minutes later, a new noise broke the silence. And this one was much more concerning. It was another tapping sound, but this time, it wasn't coming from outside the siding. It sounded like it was coming from directly below them. It was coming from the basement. The living room was situated directly above an unfinished basement. The basement was mostly empty, though it did have a small kitchenette set up in one of the corners. The teenager knew that pests sometimes got into older basements, so they tried to convince themselves that a wild animal had somehow squeezed inside and was rummaging around near the kitchen area. But the fear was starting to take hold. They muted the TV once again and got off the couch. They were absolutely dreading it, but they knew they had to check. They couldn't just sit there wondering what was lurking underneath their feet. They needed to assure themselves that everything was fine so they could go to sleep. The basement had several small, rectangular windows that sat at ground level, leading directly to the backyard. The teenager reasoned that if a stray animal had made the noise outside earlier, it had probably slipped through one of those window wells, and was now knocking against one of those windows from the inside. They walked slowly over to the basement door, their heart hammering against their ribs. They turned the brass knob, opened the door, and stood at the top of the dark wooden staircase. They stared down into the pitch-black void of the unfinished basement. Down in the darkness, the tapping noise was much louder now. It was a consistent, slow tap that occurred every few seconds. For some reason, out of sheer nervous instinct, the teenager called out a shaky hello into the darkness. The tapping stopped instantly. That was the exact moment when true panic set in. If it had been a raccoon or a cat, the sound of a human voice would have caused it to scurry away, making a lot of noise. But this creature had frozen. It had reacted to the voice by going completely silent, as if it was hiding. The teenager desperately wanted to turn on the basement lights to see what was down there. But the light switch was located at the very bottom of the stairs. There was a 0% chance they were going to step down into that dark abyss to flip it. So they came up with a desperate plan. They pulled out their flip phone. They gently swung the basement door closed until it was only open a tiny crack, just wide enough to fit their hand through. They extended their arm through the gap, pointing the phone's camera toward the far corner, where they knew the basement windows were located. They closed their eyes, pressed the record button, and let the video run for a few seconds with the flash constantly firing. As soon as they stopped the recording, they yanked their arm back, slammed the heavy basement door shut, and locked it tight. They stood in the hallway, taking deep, shaky breaths, trying to calm their racing heart. They opened the phone and pulled up the recorded video file. The footage was incredibly grainy and low resolution, typical for phones of that era. But as the flash illuminated the dark room on screen, it took the teenager all of 1 second to realize the horrifying truth. There was a tall, dark figure standing perfectly still underneath one of the basement windows, and they were inside the house. The teenager let out a terrified scream, completely unable to control their reaction. They bolted down the hallway to their bedroom, slammed the door, locked it, and immediately called their dad. The father, hearing the sheer terror in his child's voice, quickly hung up and called the local police department. While the teenager was sitting on their bed, crying and talking to their parents on the phone, a loud, violent banging sound suddenly echoed through the house. It was coming from the basement door. The intruder had heard the scream and now knew he was not alone. He was violently throwing himself against the locked door, trying to break into the main, finished part of the house where the teenager was hiding. The banging went on for 5 or 6 terrifying impacts. The teenagers snapped their eyes shut, praying the lock would hold. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the banging stopped. Silence returned to the house. A few minutes later, flashing blue and red lights illuminated the bedroom windows. The police had arrived. The officers searched the basement thoroughly, but the intruder had already made his escape, slipping back out through the same window he had used to enter. The police searched the surrounding yard and the neighborhood, but the man was long gone into the night. However, when the officers inspected the basement, they realized the situation was far more dangerous than they initially thought. My parents had kept a variety of household items down there, and while several random items were missing, the most chilling discovery was made in the basement kitchenette. The police noticed the wooden knife block on the counter. The largest, sharpest carving knife in the entire rack was gone. It was a sickening realization. The intruder hadn't just been hiding. He had armed himself with a deadly weapon, and if the teenager hadn't locked that basement door, the night would have ended in a horrific tragedy. If it weren't for that grainy video on the phone, The police might have assumed it was just an imaginative kid getting scared by a wild animal, but the footage proved there was a real monster in the house. The teenager never found out who the man was, and the police never caught him. Today, nearly 20 years later, the narrator wonders if that old phone is still buried in some box of junk in their parents' attic. They hope to find it one day, just to see if the video still exists, a physical proof of the night they narrowly escaped a predator. And then, we move on to our third story. This one takes us back just 4 years ago, when the narrator was 16 years old. They grew up in a large, beautiful suburban house that their parents had purchased before they were even born. From the outside, the house looked completely normal, just like any other home on the block. But once you stepped inside, you began to notice all of these strange architectural quirks. The biggest quirk of the house was the basement. It was easily the largest room in the entire building. Years ago, the parents had invested a lot of money to fully finish the space, turning it into a comfortable hangout area. It had a massive, plush sectional couch, a large flat-screen TV, and a couple of storage rooms built into the very back of the space. You would think a finished basement like that would be used by the whole family all the time. But the parents were very traditional. They preferred the quiet comfort of the living room upstairs. Because of this, the basement essentially became the teenagers' private sanctuary. They spent almost all of their free time down there, hanging out, playing games, and hosting friends. The other important detail you need to know about is the family cat, Rocky. Rocky was an incredibly friendly, high-energy cat who constantly craved attention. He was so needy that he would constantly bother the parents while they were trying to sleep. Because of this, the parents had a strict routine. Every night before they went to bed, they would carry Rocky down to the basement and shut him in, so he wouldn't disturb anyone upstairs. Now, there was another unique feature to this basement that played a major role in what happened. The basement had a solid interior wood door that connected directly to the garage. It was originally designed as a convenient way to bring groceries straight into the house without having to walk through the front door. But for a 16-year-old, this door served a very different purpose. It was the perfect, stealthy way to sneak friends into the house late at night without the parents ever knowing. It was a Friday night when the incident occurred. The narrator remembers the day clearly because they had invited a girl named Malene over. Since there was no school the next day, they knew they could stay up late without worrying. The narrator had snuck Malene in through the garage door, and they were sitting on the sectional couch, watching a movie. The narrator had assumed that Rocky the cat was already downstairs with them. It wasn't a conscious thought, just an automatic assumption. It was already past the hour when their parents usually put the cat down for the night, so they figured Rocky was probably just curled up asleep in one of the dark corners or inside one of the back storage rooms. So, when the narrator heard a faint rustling sound coming from one of the storage rooms in the back, they didn't think twice about it. It was a soft, shuffling noise, like cardboard boxes being gently moved around. To the narrator, this sounded exactly like a playful, curious cat climbing over old storage containers. They felt completely justified in staying calm. They didn't want to seem paranoid in front of Malene, so they just ignored it. But Malene immediately tensed up. She looked toward the dark hallway leading to the storage rooms. The narrator smiled and quickly reassured her, telling her it was just Rocky playing in the boxes. Malene relaxed a bit, and they went back to watching the movie, but the noises didn't stop. Every few minutes there would be another faint rustle, followed by a soft thud. Each time Malene would look over with a worried expression, and each time the narrator would laugh it off, explaining that Rocky was just a very active cat who loved to climb on things. And that was true. Rocky did love to climb. The narrator was completely calm, right up until they heard a very distinct sound. It was the sound of claws scratching at the wooden door at the very top of the basement stairs. The door that led to the main kitchen upstairs. The narrator's heart stopped. They knew that sound instantly. It was Rocky. He was scratching at the upstairs door, trying to get down into the basement. That meant Rocky was not in the basement with them. He was upstairs, locked out. And that meant whatever had been rustling and making thudding noises in the dark storage room for the last half hour was absolutely not the cat. The narrator sat frozen on the couch. their brain frantically trying to process this terrifying piece of information. They didn't say anything immediately. They didn't want to send Malene into a state of panic, and they were also struggling to believe their own eyes. Maybe they had misheard? Maybe it was just a random house creak? But before they could say a word, Malene, who was sitting right next to them, let out a blood-curdling scream. It was a scream of pure, unadulterated terror. The narrator whipped their head around. Malene was pointing a trembling finger toward the dark, open doorway of the back storage room. The narrator turned their head to look, and what they saw made their blood run cold. A small, bright foam football was slowly rolling across the carpeted floor. It had clearly just been thrown out of the pitch-black storage room. There was someone standing in the dark, watching them. The narrator couldn't see a face or a silhouette, because the back of the basement was cast in deep shadow. But the rolling toy was undeniable proof. Someone had been hiding in that small storage room the entire time they had been sitting on the couch. Instinct took over. The narrator grabbed Malene's arm with a tight grip, practically dragging her off the couch and pulling her toward the stairs. They scrambled up the wooden steps as fast as their legs could carry them. As soon as they burst through the door at the top, the narrator slammed it shut, making sure to scoop up Rocky so the cat wouldn't run down into the danger zone. The next few minutes were a blur of absolute chaos. Malene was sobbing uncontrollably, completely traumatized by what had just happened. The narrator was shaking so violently they could barely hold their own phone. They had never experienced that level of primal fear in their entire life. The noise woke up the narrator's parents, who rushed out of their bedroom to see what was wrong. Once they realized there was an intruder in the basement, the father immediately called the police. The local authorities arrived within minutes, their sirens echoing through the quiet neighborhood. While the officers prepared to search the house, the narrator went out onto the back deck, keeping their eyes glued to the exterior garage door. Since the only way out of the basement besides the main stairs was through the garage, the narrator knew that if the intruder tried to escape, they would have to come out that way. They watched the door like a hawk, determined to see who this person was. But here is where the story takes a very bizarre turn. The police officers searched every single inch of the finished basement, the storage rooms, and the attached garage. They found absolutely no one. Furthermore, there were no signs of forced entry. All of the basement windows were securely locked from the inside, and the garage door was completely shut. One of the responding officers suggested that the intruder must have slipped out through the garage right before the police arrived. But the narrator knew that was physically impossible. They had been standing on the back deck, watching the only exit the entire time. No one had come out of that door. With no evidence, no suspect, and no signs of a break-in, there was nothing more the police could do. They eventually left, leaving the family in a state of deep unease. The parents believed the police officer's theory, assuming the teenager must have missed the intruder slipping away in the dark. The father was particularly upset, feeling like his son's carelessness had put everyone in danger. But the narrator didn't care what they thought. They were 100% certain of what they saw. No one had escaped through that garage. To this day, the family has never gotten any resolution or answers about that night. The narrator is still left with the chilling question of how someone could have entered their basement, played a horrific game with them in the dark, and then vanished into thin air without leaving a single trace behind. At this point, we have to look at our final story, which might be the most deeply personal and haunting of them all. It is a common truth that almost every child is afraid of basements. They are naturally dark, cold, and mysterious places. Even as adults, many of us still feel that irrational urge to run up the basement stairs after turning off the lights, as if some unseen entity is about to grab our ankles. But for the narrator of this story, that childhood fear was rooted in a very real, very terrifying experience. When they were about 9 years old, they lived in a spacious family home. The basement was the designated entertainment zone because it was the only place in the house, other than the living room and the parents' bedroom, that had a television. Naturally, this was where the video game consoles were set up. During the weekends, the 9-year-old loved to stay up late, playing their favorite video games. At the time, They were completely obsessed with a game called Driver 2 on the original PlayStation. It was an incredibly difficult game, and no matter how many hours they poured into it, they could never seem to beat the final missions. They spent countless Friday and Saturday nights gripped by the screen, trying over and over again to complete the game. Usually, they didn't like to stay up past the point when their parents went to sleep. As long as they could hear the muffled sounds of their mom or dad watching television upstairs, they felt safe. The knowledge that help was just a quick sprint up the stairs allowed them to brave the creepy basement atmosphere. Just like many suburban homes, this basement housed the laundry and boiler room. It was a utility space, and it was easily the most terrifying room in the entire house. It was always pitch black because it had absolutely no windows to let in natural light. And because it contained the water heater and the furnace, it was constantly making strange mechanical noises, deep hums, and sudden clangs. Even when the heavy wooden door to the laundry room was shut, the narrator would occasionally pause their game, muting the television to listen to some unusual sound echoing from inside. They always managed to convince themselves it was just the boiler. But on one particular weekend night, they heard a sound that could not be explained by a machine. It started with the distinct, slow creak of the laundry room door swinging open. The narrator immediately froze. They paused Driver 2, their eyes locking onto the dark doorway of the utility room. An uncomfortable, heavy silence fell over the basement, and then, the silence was broken by a sound that made their heart leap into their throat. It was the sound of a woman groaning and moaning in a low, ghost-like tone. But it didn't sound like a monster. It sounded exactly like the narrator's mother. The narrator's first reaction was actually relief. They assumed their mother had snuck down the stairs to play a prank on them, trying to scare them into going to bed. They let out a nervous laugh and called out, telling her nice try, and that she couldn't scare them that easily. Looking back on it now as an adult, the narrator realizes how strange that assumption was. Their mother was a very serious, practical woman. She was never the type of person to play silly pranks or goof around, especially late at night. But as a 9-year-old child, the brain will grasp at any logical explanation to avoid facing true terror. Feeling a sudden surge of confidence, the narrator stood up from the floor and walked slowly toward the laundry room door. As they stepped in front of the open doorway, the eerie groaning sounds suddenly stopped. The basement was dead silent once again. The narrator stared straight into the pitch-black room, waiting for their mom to jump out and laugh. They took a few steps closer, their eyes straining to adjust to the darkness. And as they did, the faint outline of a person standing perfectly still in the dark became visible. "Mom?" the narrator whispered, their confidence rapidly evaporating. They took one more step, getting just close enough for their eyes to map the shape of the figure. And in that split second, they realized with absolute certainty that the person standing in the pitch black was not their mother. The figure was too tall, the posture was completely wrong, and there was a strange, chaotic energy radiating from the darkness. The narrator let out a blood-curdling scream. They turned on their heel and sprinted up the basement stairs as fast as their legs could carry them, bursting into the living room. Their screams had already alerted their parents. Both their mother and father were already standing up, looking toward the basement door with expressions of deep concern. The narrator sobbed, screaming that there was a strange woman standing inside the laundry room. They expected their parents to console them, or perhaps for their father to grab a flashlight and investigate. Instead, the parents exchanged a sudden, terrified look. Without saying a word to the narrator, they both ran down the basement stairs, slamming the heavy doors shut behind them. The narrator was left standing alone in the living room, confused, terrified, but also slightly relieved that their parents were handling it. They sat on the living room couch for what felt like hours. Finally, the mother came back upstairs. She looked incredibly pale and shaken. She didn't explain what had happened down there. Instead, she gently told the narrator to go straight to their bedroom and go to sleep. The narrator didn't ask any questions. They were too exhausted and frightened to protest. The next morning, the parents sat the narrator down at the kitchen table. They had a strange, light-hearted tone as they explained that the whole thing had just been a big joke. They claimed they had asked one of their old friends, who was visiting from out of state, to hide in the basement and play a prank to teach the narrator a lesson about staying up too late. The narrator wanted to believe them, so they accept out the story. But they asked who the friend was. The mother quickly replied that it was a friend named Debbie. Over the years, the narrator didn't think much about it. But as they grew older, they noticed a strange pattern. Every now and then, the name Debbie would slip out during family conversations. Whenever the narrator would ask who Debbie was, the parents would get visibly nervous and quickly change the subject, offering conflicting stories about who this person actually was. When the narrator was about 14 years old, they decided they were old enough to find the truth. One afternoon, when their parents were out, they found a popular genealogy and family records website. To access the detailed files, they needed to pay a small fee. So they quickly took their father's credit card from his wallet, paid for the service, and slipped the card back before anyone noticed. They typed in both of their parents' names and began scanning through the family tree. Among a list of familiar aunts, uncles, and cousins, one name jumped out at them. Their mother had a sister named Debbie. The narrator immediately opened a search engine and typed in Debbie's full name, along with their mother's maiden name. Within seconds, an article and an obituary popped up on the screen. Debbie was dead. But the details of her life were deeply unsettling. The narrator waited until their parents came home. They stood in the living room, holding up the computer screen, and demanded to know the truth. The parents looked absolutely shocked. They realized they could no longer hide the secret. The father looked at the mother and quietly told her to explain. The mother sat down and dropped a massive bomb on the narrator. It turned out that Debbie was indeed the mother's sister, but she suffered from severe untreated mental illness. She was highly unstable, dangerous, and had a history of violent behavior. She had severely harmed multiple people in the past, which was why the parents had made a strict decision to keep her completely out of the narrator's life to protect them. On that terrifying night years ago, Debbie had somehow managed to sneak into the suburban house without the parents ever knowing. She had slipped into the basement and hidden in the dark laundry room, waiting. The narrator was flooded with questions. How had she gotten in? Why did she make those eerie sounds? What did she want? But the parents refused to elaborate any further. They insisted they had acted in the narrator's best interest by lying to them, wanting to protect their childhood innocence from the harsh, terrifying reality of a dangerous family member. Whenever the narrator tried to bring it up in the years that followed, the parents would immediately shut the conversation down, telling them to let the past go. But some things are impossible to let go. To this day, the narrator is left with a lingering sense of unease. They wonder exactly what their parents meant when they said Debbie had harmed people. They wonder what would have happened if they had taken one more step into that dark laundry room 20 years ago. And perhaps most disturbingly, they wonder if their parents were truly trying to protect them, or if there was an even darker secret hidden within the walls of that old family home. Some questions, it seems, are destined to remain unanswered in the dark. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.